We've got 40 in Denver. All right, we got 36. Dennis, where are you at? With your light snow and rain too? It's a little chilly for me. Just north of now. Okay, sorry, Denver folks. Yep, we got a little snow, a little chill in the air. Very good. All right, well, we'll get started for our webinar on today. Thank you for joining us. Today we'll be talking about crime scene response and coordination in fatal and non-fatal shootings. This webinar will focus on the importance of crime scene response to fatal and non-fatal shooting incidents and discuss evidence analysis processes, including firearm examination, DNA collection analysis, and latent fingerprint collection and analysis. Patrick, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please. Thank you. This project is supported by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. Please note that points of view and opinion shared during the webinar and associated documents are those of RTI International and do not officially represent those of the U.S. Department of Justice. Go to the next slide, please, Patrick. Today's presenters are John Grassel, Ivy Walker, and Michele Smith. And I'm going to pass it to them. John, if you'll start giving your introduction, just share some of your background with us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm John Grassel. I'm a senior manager in the Investigative Sciences program at RTI. Prior to RTI, I retired from the Rhode Island State Police, where I led our forensic services unit. And I also am the past president of the International Association for Identification, the IAI, and the forensics chair for the IACP. And I will pass it to Ivy Walker.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ivy Walker. I am a research forensic scientist at RTI International. Been there just over 1.5 years, and I'm based out of Raleigh. I have a background in latent prints. I've been in forensics for just over a decade, and I worked at a North Carolina State Crime Laboratory where I was a latent print examiner, and I also did footwear and tire track analysis. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michele Smith. I am the crime scene unit supervisor over at the Louisiana State Police Crime Laboratory down in Louisiana and based out of Baton Rouge. And so I've been there about 12 years. I started out in latent prints. I did some test fires for NIBIN as well. And then kind of moved my way up to comparisons, all while doing crime scene from the beginning there. And then in 2019, got promoted to supervisor over our crime scene section. And we actually do call outs all across the state of Louisiana, major crime scenes, helping out state police as well as our sheriffs and police departments. And I'm also a member of OSAC, current vice chair of our scene examination SAC for OSAC, and of course, members of the IAI as well, and our local Louisiana IAI also.
Thank you all, and thank you all for joining us today. Next slide, please. So this will be an interactive discussion today. So as you get questions that come up, please share those in our Q&A section of Zoom, and we'll share them with our presenters as we're able. Just to go over the objectives for today's webinar, they include the importance of crime scene response to shootings, in particular fatal and non-fatal shootings, critical steps to crime scene response and evidence collection to support investigations. We'll review various evidence processes and discuss the importance of collaboration with the crime lab, evidence personnel, and law enforcement. Next slide. Just to give a quick, for those that aren't familiar, just give a quick high-level overview of the National Case Closed Project if you're not familiar with it. Through the project, we support law enforcement agencies who are experiencing high violent crime rates with improving their clearance rates. And we focus on fatal and non-fatal shootings, as you've heard us say. We have a team of SMEs who provide on-site assessments with participating agencies, which is then followed up with tailored training and technical assistance to identify and implement effective and sustainable practices to improve their shooting outcomes. We also have developed a variety of resources, which you can find on our website. And Peyton is going to share the link to our website as well as our toolkit in the chat. She'll also share with you a link to one of our recent National Case Closed podcasts using forensics intelligence to stop gun violence cases. That aligns well with our topic today. So that's just one example of a product we've developed. If you have any questions about the National Case Closed project, please feel free to reach out to the team. We'll put our email in the chat as well as sign up for our newsletter to get updates on different products and events for the project. Now I will pass it back to our presenters.
Great, thanks, Elise. So we were talking before in preparation of this, and one thing we quickly realized is that the three of us are so passionate about crime scene and then follow-on work. We literally could have made this, an all-day webinar, but being as we have our time constraints, we'll start with talking about the importance of crime scene response. And I think anyone who has taken a basic crime scene class has heard the old adage that, you can have the best prosecutor, you can have the greatest lab functions, you can have the most state-of-the-art equipment, but if you kind of don't do the crime scene right, so to speak, then your case goes downhill rapidly. Michele, talk us through, if you could, the importance of identifying the extent of the crime scene. What do we mean by that?
So what John says is true. When you get to the scene, that's going to be where everything starts, right? And so making sure that you do what you need to at the scene is going to really help your case all the way down the line. So understanding the extent of that crime scene is going to be very important. And what we mean by that is, initially when first responders get there and they're assessing the scene and they're trying to figure out how far does this scene reach. They may have to expand the scene tape or, make sure that things are being secured at a further distance than they were initially. So just determining the full extent of the scene, as you discover it is going to be important to maintain that integrity.
And Ivy, I know we've talked in the past about, search warrants or consent to search, and so you arrive at a scene, who would you notify, and what kind of actions do you need to take pretty soon after arriving as far as notification?
Well, if there's a body there in particular, you need to typically notify either the medical examiner, the coroner, or even the DA in some cases, as they have jurisdiction over the body. So making sure you know the proper channels to get that notification going before you touch anything from the body, like evidence or moving the position. And as far as getting search warrants, making sure that you want to get a search warrant regardless, and that's typically done after the scene is deemed safe and it's secured.
Great. And if we could move on to our next slide, please. So we talked scene assessment. You've gotten to the scene, you've made some of your notification. I know one of the things that obviously every police department, every crime scene response unit has different types of resources. Michele, knowing your resources, what are we talking about?
So it's important to understand what capacity you have people at the scene in. So, if you need to call in for people to do specialized processing, whether it's for fingerprints or blood or trajectory analysis, blood stain pattern analysis, those types of things, you need to be able to know who to call in those instances, as well as knowing, kind of what is capable of being done in certain situations. Know the full extent of the evidence that you do have at the scene, what can be done with that to give you the best possible investigative leads in your case.
And Ivy, I know that some labs prefer to do, everything. Some labs kind of like it if a crime scene unit triages. What are some of the things involved with knowing the capabilities of your lab? So you're not just knowing the capabilities of your crime scene people, you kind of have to know the wishes and the capabilities of your lab, right?
Definitely. You can have you know, as a unit, you can have certain things that you could process fingerprints on a basic level, but if you're interested in anything more or something that you may not be able to do in-house, know what the laboratories can do at the full extent, because they may be able to do something that you can't. But also it's important to know that if you do something at the scene, sometimes it might prevent the full extent of the analysis if you do end up sending it to the lab. So be sure that you know the policies and procedures of the laboratory before you do anything. And sometimes it is easier if you pick up the phone and call someone from the lab. They may tell you just submit the whole item, we'll process it from start to finish.
And Michelle, I'm sure you've been to scenes where you've gotten there, and we'll particularly talk about shooting scenes where the lead detective or the lead investigator or maybe management at your agency will want to say, where did the bullet come from? Where was the shooter standing? What are some of the, say, the limitations that, at least initially, you're kind of leery to provide for fear that you may not be accurate?
Right. No, and that's actually a good point. Trajectory is an approximation to begin with, so it's something that you do have to be cautious when you're not only performing trajectory analysis, but the information that you're giving at the time. Our lab, for instance, does trajectory analysis on scene, as well as back at the laboratory, almost like a shooting reconstruction aspect. So you do need to be cautious about giving too much information away initially until you have, verified some of those results. Some things are straightforward and can be a little bit more straightforward on scene to discuss and kind of give some of that initial information, because some of that could be helpful on scene depending on the context and everything as well. So, knowing that fine line between, what information can I give that would be helpful at this point, and what information, should you kind of be cautious about until it's verified further, until you have some sort of, documentation to kind of back that up.
Right. And then Ivy, as far as, you've recovered, obviously you're going to recover the cartridge casings at a scene, but you're now searching for bullets and impacts. Besides, obviously, a victim that a bullet may pass through or enter, what is some other information that you've seen, that you've gotten from the bullet, as far as when the lab processes it, or when you look at it in closer detail at the scene?
The bullet could tell you what type of surface it may have come in contact with. So looking at those types of things might give you a direction to further search if you see something like that. And Michele, I think you have a story with that, as far as having a bullet go from different areas in a wall and then maybe even through glass.
Yes,
Could you
yeah.
speak to that?
Yeah, a lot of times, what Ivy's saying is true. So when you have kind of particles and stuff embedded in the nose of the bullet, or the front end of the bullet, if you will, as it passes through those multiple surfaces, you can kind of see that. And we actually had one that passed through an electrical box. So it was like a blue plastic electrical box that would be like on a home that you would see under construction. And so it passed through that, and actually you could see it was a hollow point bullet. So the nose cavity was caved in, and the bullet's designed that way for special purposes, of course. But when it goes through certain materials, that nose of that bullet fills up, and it actually keeps the bullet from expanding. And so when we recovered the bullet later, we saw that there were actually pieces of melted plastic of the blue in the nose of the bullet. So you could see that, okay, this was the bullet, in fact, that passed through that electrical box that we documented earlier. So it just kind of, sometimes it helps link up those shots. If you have bullets that you recovered in one area and you're not exactly sure which bullet goes with what shot, if you had multiple shots, sometimes that can be a good identifier.
And I'm hoping I'm not the only one that this has happened to, but you've collected, say 7 casings at a scene, and you can only find, 3 or 4 bullet holes. Has that happened to the two of you
Yeah,
as well?
I feel like that's normal, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just, they travel so far, and
Yeah.
sometimes it's just unknown, right, where they're going. So if we want to move on to the next slide, please. So documentation considerations, I think we've we've all been at scenes that, you know, you've second guessed it a couple days later and said, I wish I had taken blank, right? But obviously, you know, the size considerations, there's scene considerations that for whatever reason don't allow you to take an entire apartment or entire you know, fleet of vehicles back to be processed later. But what plays into your head, either of you, that, you know, when you want to properly document a scene, but you just, you know, obviously for reasons you can't take everything. What do you do?
Usually try to take as many pictures as you can. You know, the photograph is actually going to capture things that you may not even realize were important at the time. So, you know, at the bare minimum, try to take as many pictures and capture as much of the scene in good detail as possible. And, you know, the photograph can do a lot of that work for you. Um, you know, all you can do is work with the information that you have at the time, you know, and if you realize that something's important later on, there may not be an opportunity to go back and get something if you didn't collect it initially, but hopefully at least in the photographs or something you know, taken a picture of it, its location, where it was. You know, that happens to us, you know, I mean, something becomes important weeks after, you know, and you're like, well, we at the time we didn't know, you know, and so you can only do the best you can. So
I think that's such a great point too, with the photographs and making sure that they're good photographs.
right.
You know, taking, especially in the digital photography age, you can go back and look at your picture and make sure, okay, this is not blurry. And if it is, go ahead and
Right.
retake it. Or if you're doing something up close, think about putting a scale in there, even if you're not
That's
sure if it's gonna come up later, because you can never get those back, at least to the same extent as it would have been at that time.
And I know many of us have worked for, and people are on this call that may be part of accredited agencies, and you know, something that comes up a lot is bias, and we try to limit the bias that we have. So obviously, you're getting a call. Let's say it's the middle of the night. Respond to a scene. Well, you kind of need to know something about the scene, right? And
Right.
how do you walk that balance beam between knowing too much that it might bias what you collect or document, and not knowing enough that you're going to miss an important article of evidence?
That's a very fine line, and unfortunately, sometimes there are things that, you know, you just can't control. So, you know, what we usually try to tell our people is we need to know the information, at least some of the main important facts, because that's going to tell us whether we're bringing the proper equipment and resources to make sure that we process the scene effectively. But I always tell people, you know, like you can do a lot of things at every scene, but is all of that going to be actually relevant? You know, so um, you know, so you make judgment calls based on the information that you have and kind of what you're seeing already, the evidence that you're seeing. So it is important though to be mindful, you know, if they call you and say, hey, this may be a possible suicide, and you get there and you're seeing evidence that it may not be a suicide, that you do, of course, pay attention to that. So you do follow the evidence once you do get on scene and start seeing what that evidence is telling you or what it's not telling you. You know, that could be important too. The absence of evidence is also important as well. So, you know, that's going to be very important.
Yeah, and I saw that someone put in the chat, Kathy, I believe, that her agency takes video without sound prior to it happening. First, let's talk video. Michele, do you still take video?
We do, and just like Kathy said, we take ours without sound as well. So, yeah, we do still take video in addition to our photographs. Yeah.
And Ivy, let's talk collection of cartridge casings. Are you putting them in a separate bag? Are you putting them all together? Are you putting them grouped by caliber or location? How do you do it?
Well, I think it depends on agency policy. I've seen at the lab anyway, I've seen it different ways. But having them individually packaged can often be nice, or grouped by caliber. It really just depends on what your agency has seen or what the laboratory that if you're submitting to a laboratory, what they prefer. But as a note on packaging, if you do small packaging for each individual shell casing, something that we might talk about later with packaging is making sure that that piece the envelope or whatever it is that you're putting it in is big enough to accommodate markings later on for chain of custody and opening and sealing and resealing.
Yeah. And I know in the chat when we started this webinar, we had some people say that they were in like snow conditions, right? So we all enter a crime scene with a particular plan in mind, and I'm going to go from point 1 all the way down to point 307. But now it's snowing. Michele, how do you deviate? What do you do in that case?
Fortunately, it doesn't snow very often in
Yeah.
Louisiana. We'd probably have bigger problems if that was the case. But no, but we do get a lot of rain, so same kind of thing, right? Anything that's going to mess up your day outside, that's for sure. So being able to deviate is key, you know, and we talked about this kind of beforehand when we were putting together these slides and these outlines and stuff that you know, a lot of that is just documentation. If you have to do something out of what your normal order would be because there was environmental conditions, and sometimes it's not even environmental, sometimes it's, you know, a rush, like, hey, you know, the body is being eaten by ants. We have that regularly. You know, like we need to go ahead and do what we need to do with the body before we collect anything else, you know. So kind of do what you have to do to make sure that you can take care of what's happening with the body, you know, in the corners there and that kind of thing. Because of other environmental conditions. So again, just documenting what you're doing and why you're doing it, especially if it's out of what your normal order or protocol may be, is really the important thing. I mean, there's always going to be a reason why you're doing something potentially out of order, you know. So just documentation on that.
And when you say documentation, your notes are discoverable, correct? So you're turning those
They
notes
are,
into
yes.
whoever the case agent is, I guess that's turning it into the DA's office, right?
Correct. Yeah. And what we have actually is like a 52-page PDF document that we fill in. So and we actually just converted like 2 months ago into digital notes. So before we were printing those pages out and handwriting at the scene, and it was they're they're notes that we made that like basically have check boxes and spaces for you to fill in things. So it prompts you on what to fill in different aspects of the scene, documentation and stuff, evidence collection and all of that. So now we just transition to a digital format of that where we're actually writing on a notepad digitally. So it's an adjustment for us. But yes, those become a PDF and get uploaded into our case files and are discoverable.
And one weird consideration that you read about, but then you don't often, it doesn't often occur, on an average scene, say, is the gun has been tossed in water. What do I do in that case? Or what do you generally recommend?
If you are recovering something that was in water, whether it's a gun or something else that has the possibility to rust, you're going to recover it and store it in the same type of water that it was in. So if it was in a stream, for example, you'll want to put it in some kind of container, like a clean paint can or even another clean container that you have around, and fill it with the water and put it in there to preserve it until you're able to get it back to your lab or submit it. And if you are submitting it, usually giving the lab a heads up that we have something in water, and they'll know what to do to process it further. And there's special reagents for that. But we want to protect it from rust so that it'll still function down the road, or you can get any evidence off of it that's already on there.
Great. We transition to the next slide, please. So it's everyone's favorite discussion on lab coordination, and we've all, just like crime scene people, lab people are also dealing with shortage of personnel and turnaround times. And I don't think there's a crime scene investigator that I've ever met that's that's not wrestled with the problem of how much evidence can I submit, and when can I get when can I get the results of that evidence back. One of the things that in the Case Closed project that I've learned is many of the lab people that we've talked to are more than willing to give kind of classes, whether it's at an in-service or a monthly meeting that detectives or crime scene investigators have, and the lab people are more than happy to come out and help train. They would much rather do that than get evidence into the lab that's kind of not either packaged or not the type of evidence that they would like. Ivy, how important is coordination with your lab?
Oh, I think it's so important. It's kind of like like a secret weapon, having someone at the lab that you can call up and ask specific questions to, and they can help guide you through a tough situation, or if you're not sure what to do, and then you're creating that communication for future issues, and then hopefully the word will spread around your agency of doing things correctly. And like John said, I think a lot of labs, they're happy to come and give a training or provide an overview of how things are preferred, because there's been so many times where things are submitted, but they just make things in the lab go a little bit longer than they need to. And so, there's so many agencies submitting to a lab usually. So having you pick up the phone to call the lab, I think would be really beneficial for your agency.
Michele, you have the luxury of having the state lab, but assuming that you can't just turn in everything, right? So even though you'd probably want to.
That is true, yes. And we actually, when we come out and process a scene for our local law enforcement agencies in Louisiana, we act as the go-between for them and the lab. So they actually do get that added benefit where they get our kind of personal involvement. So not only were we there to collect the evidence at the scene, but we're also there to say, hey, like for DNA, for instance, I think these are going to be your best 3 items, or best couple of items to submit for these things based on the scenario and the case details and kind of the evidence that was collected. So but yes, and it is surprising a lot of agencies that don't know what our lab's capabilities are within their state, right? So it is important to connect with them, and we're always willing to come out and discuss, hey, these are the services that we offer, this is what kind of stuff we can do with certain types of evidence. And just those evidence submission policies like we were talking about, because you do have to put limitations on things. It would be nice if we could work everything in every case, but unfortunately that's not the reality. So yeah, those conversations are important. Yeah. Yeah.
In addition to the training too, something I remembered is sometimes we would get a question about another specific type of evidence, and it was at a shooting scene, but there were tire tracks.
Yeah.
And the agency, they weren't very familiar with how to take tire track standards, but the lab, we did. And so we actually went out and we helped take tire track standards. So we teamed up to do that. So it kind of alleviated some of the burden, but also they learned that way. And then we had exactly what we needed as far
That's
as
right.
this is how we would want the standards.
Right.
So a lot of times they may be willing to come out and actually help you with something that isn't routine.
Yeah, and that's very important, because the way to preserve the evidence at the scene that's best for the lab is just a win-win, so if you can help them do that, then that's what's best for the case, it's what's best for the analysis. They get what they need out of it, it all works out. Yeah.
Exactly.
Great, thank you. And next slide, please. Yeah, see, we had to push this topic a little later in the discussion, or else Ivy would have dominated our entire talk just on latent prints. But Ivy, what is the value of latent, especially with regards to evidence from shooting scenes?
Okay, I'll try to keep it simple. Latent prints in shooting scenes in particular, there are so many surfaces that are conducive for receiving latent prints. So, guns, bullets, potentially shell casings, depending on, especially if they've been handled after they've been shot, boxes of bullets, all of these things surrounding very specific gun evidence. A lot of those have a high possibility of recovering prints. And fingerprints in general, if you're looking at prints, or if you've powdered for prints, for example, you're looking at the ridges, which on that screen right there, the lines, those are the ridges. And then the features on the ridges are what we as examiners are really concerned about. And those features relative to one another are what make fingers discriminating. So it's a great piece of evidence from things like shooting scenes, something from specific gun type evidence. There are different surfaces that are more conducive to receiving prints than others. So smooth surfaces like the sides of a magazine or the sides of a gun, the smooth barrels, smooth slides, those are really great surfaces to try to get fingerprints from. And then rough surfaces on types of evidence like that, like the grip, there might be a very textured grip on a gun. Those, in addition to some of the texture on a slide, may not be as conducive to receiving fingerprints, but that's something important to keep in mind if you're interested in collecting for DNA, because those might be a better space to attempt to collect DNA from those surfaces.
Great. And then, Michele, I'm sure that you've wrestled with this as most of us have, which is, in an ideal world, you would turn the gun in as is, as collected from a scene, but in that way, no one has touched it, and it's got as much DNA or as much latent prints as you possibly can. But try submitting that loaded gun to a lab and let's see what happens, right? What do you do? How do you deal with that? And then how do you also deal with those cases where it's rusted, or maybe the crime scene investigator that you've sent out to the scene is not overly familiar yet with firearms, but can't, obviously has to submit that weapon. What do you do?
So all good questions for sure. We have a lab policy where we do not accept guns that are loaded. And there's certain precautions that they have to take when submitting evidence to our laboratory, especially firearms evidence, to make sure that it's denoted on the box that it is not loaded and who rendered it safe, with their signature. Now, crime scene's a little different because when we go out, we are the ones responsible for rendering that firearm safe before we package it. So that's our protocol, is to make sure it gets rendered safe before going in packaging. Now, if we do come across an instance where, like Ivy was mentioning, the gun is in water and maybe it is already rusting and we can't physically render that gun safe because of the damage to the gun, that is an instance where we will collect it as is and make sure that there's a lot of documentation on the outside of that packaging to show that that gun is not rendered safe. And that's something that we would bring in directly straight to a firearms examiner and have them start working on that evidence to get it in a safe condition. If you're an outside agency submitting something like that to us, that's a phone call that we typically encourage them to make. So if they are somewhere when they're collecting a gun, we will walk them through it. And it's usually our crime scene people, because we're on call 24/7. So not just to respond, but for phone calls and assistance over the phone as well. So we can walk them through what they need to do to properly package that firearm in this particular case. If it's something that they're just not comfortable with rendering safe, because maybe it's kind of an unusual gun, and we do come across some strange, old guns that are kind of not the norm on how to render safe and make sure that, you have removed the source of ammunition, which is one of the first things that you would do to render it safe, of course. So, if it's something that they're not too familiar with, they can bring the gun in loaded or in that condition. But that's something that we would take in directly in firearms, in our firearms section. So it wouldn't come in through the front normal, like the rest of the evidence would typically. Yeah.
Ivy, I'm going to put you on the spot. So for your comparisons of fingerprints, did you have a greater success with the photograph of the latent print or the lift of the latent print?
Great question. It depended. However, it was nice to have the photograph. It was always nice to have the photograph to lean back on. We did get a lot of lifts in, but sometimes there would be debris under the lift. And an example would be a surface that had peeling paint. So the print was powdered and then it was lifted and you had little pieces of paint, and then the tape itself wasn't quite as smooth. And so having to go back to that photograph where it was nicely contrasted on the wall, for example, cases like that make it really important to have the photograph. So having the photograph every time is really a good practice before you take a lift.
And Michelle, do you stick with that same policy? Do you do the overall, the mid-range, and then a close-up before you do any processing or lifting?
Absolutely, yeah. And actually, John, we don't really lift anymore here at our lab. So primarily, we just photograph. The only time that we're going to lift a print is if the photograph was challenging for some reason, like if we had some background interference. Sometimes on vehicles, they have that shiny clear coat that sometimes has like sparkles or flakes in it that can mess with your photography. But most of the time, I would say probably about 99.7% of the time we're just photographing. So, and that was a big adjustment. We made that adjustment almost, I would say about 8 years ago, where we primarily switched to not lifting just to lift. We capture our fingerprints in a photograph, whether it's at the patent stage or the developed stage. And we just like I said, we only lift if we feel like it can support the picture somehow, or show something the picture couldn't for whatever reason. But 90% of the time the picture is going to be typically better.
And for that, Michelle, in my processing experience in a laboratory setting, the same. I think I took 2 lifts maybe in my 9 years there, because a lot of the times when we were processing, powder was a component, but we really relied on a lot of the fluorescent dyes.
Correct.
And so the alternate light source with the fluorescent dyes, having the photography with the filter, it was much better. But when we got things from the crime scene, we did get a lot of lifts. But again, it was nice to have the backup. So if you had to choose one.
Right.
Okay, perfect segue to the next slide, please. Ivy, if you could continue a little and talk about reagents. So when we talk about reagents at crime scenes and what could be done, or in some cases, obviously we talked about evidence that for whatever reason cannot be collected and brought back to the lab, but there's also evidence that, case dependent may be better to process at the scene, say. What are some of the reagents that you would typically see at scenes, and if you could discuss that a little.
At scenes, you could see powder, of course, having a light source before that. Powder, there's different types of reagents depending on if you're looking at a non-porous surface, so a surface where a print is going to sit on top of the surface versus a porous surface where a print would absorb into it. And those types of surfaces would be treated differently with reagents. You can do super glue fuming at the scene. You can make your own tint, as long as you have plenty of ventilation and you're wearing some proper PPE. There was a link in the chat actually that takes you to the fingerprint source book. And in that, chapter 7 has a list of all kinds of reagents that are available, and some that have an aqueous option that make it more safe to have out in the field versus in a fume hood. Some of those are, you could have an anhydrine, for example. Dye stains may be a little bit tougher, but that's, again, one of those things, thinking about what you want to get from the surface, because if you want the whole gamut, it might be better to submit it to the lab. And also back to our conversation with knowing what your lab policies are. If you're submitting it, if you do something that might be in the middle of their sequential process, they may not go back and redo it. So to have the full spectrum of possibilities, it may be better to send it to the lab. So think about that before you attempt to process anything.
Great. Next slide, please. So DNA, I know that you can't go through a training without talking about wearing gloves. Besides the fact that, you're handling different items, talk to us about gloves, Michele. How often are you changing gloves? And do you, if you're positive you're not going to submit something to the lab, but you don't think you are you still changing gloves in those cases?
That's a great question. DNA has gotten so sensitive and it can pick up so much, which is great. But at the same time, your risk of contamination, it becomes higher at that point. So, what we caution our crime scene analysts to do is to make sure that not only are we wearing a mask and gloves, but that we're changing our gloves often. And down here in Louisiana, it's hot. We sweat a lot, so it's humid most of the time. Even now, it's 80 degrees right now, and humidity is really high. So even working a crime scene in what we would consider fall is still, where you would sweat and stuff. So what we typically do, we use like a little trick where we call it the two glove method. So we'll actually put a base pair of gloves on, our nitrile gloves, and then we'll put another layer on top of that. So then we just remove that top layer. So if you've ever tried to put on gloves and you have sweaty hands, a new pair of gloves is going to be pretty difficult sometimes. You have to let your hands dry and all of that. So we just try to avoid some of that, and minimize some of that contamination. So, and the important thing too is to make sure that you're putting on your mask and anything that would be on your face, whether it's goggles to see your alternate light source or whatever, make sure you're putting that on first before you put your fresh pair of gloves on. So, you can still transfer your DNA even though you're wearing gloves. You can still transfer on the glove surface from your face or something that was touching your face onto an item. So the rule of thumb is anytime you are going to handle an item that is either for sure is going to be for DNA or has the potential to be for DNA, that you put a fresh pair of gloves on. So, and in between items as well. Yeah.
And Ivy, at the lab, if you were processing an item, let's say a firearm or a magazine, and it was with you in the process for latent prints, but maybe it may have needed to go to DNA next, would you wear a mask?
Yes, and a gown and double gloves and a hairnet.
All right, we won't comment on the hairnet, I guess, but
And wiping the surface in between.
Wiping the surface, yes.
You mentioned before about some of the surfaces of a weapon that may not be great for DNA, may not be great for fingerprints, but are probably good areas for DNA. I know one of the ones, and I believe I learned this from Miami-Dade lab, was one of the things that they used to do was swab the front sight tip because suspects aren't often, utilizing a holster. So the weapons are put down the waistband of their pants, and so that front sight tip might touch the skin, and then swapping that front sight tip might lead to some value for DNA.
That's a great point as far as different surfaces that would be great for potential DNA, but also we wouldn't be able to get a usable fingerprint most likely off of a tiny surface. And so it's kind of a nice trade-off for some items of evidence, and even like the head stamp of a casing. That small surface, it could yield a portion of a print, but as far as the texture, that might be better to leave that for DNA, especially if you're coordinating between the two disciplines.
Michele, if you had recovered a firearm from a scene and now you've made it safe and you're about to bring it back to the lab, does your lab ever process the bullets that are still in the magazine that have, obviously not been fired?
Yes. Yes, we process those for prints and DNA, and we actually get relatively decent results on those. The unfired ammunition, that usually because it's protected inside of that magazine. So we get really good results on both of those. Yeah.
Great. Next slide, please. So we've talked about our quote unquote normal scenes that we're all expected to go to, or we were, but now you have sometimes where you need some special ability, right? Bloodstain pattern analysis, shooting analysis, maybe two of the areas that you would need it. talk us through, when do I need a trajectory analysis done?
So that's actually a good point. There are some things that trajectory analysis, which basically is the analysis of the path of that bullet and potential location of the shooter at the time the shot was fired, right? So that's basically what we're trying to do with trajectory analysis. Some scenes, it's not necessary to do that because you already have that information answered in some cases. So, truly, it can be very time consuming and it can be additional documentation, even if you already know the answer, basically to those questions. So it can help support those statements or any things that you may be trying to corroborate. But I would say trajectory analysis is something that we do regularly because shootings are one of the more prevalent things that we go to in Louisiana in general. Some of those high profile scenes, of course, do involve shootings. So anytime that we can do trajectory analysis, we're typically going to do it unless we're told, hey, it's really not necessary in this case by the agency, but most of the time we still do it. So it's something that, like I said, can be time consuming, and you have to have a couple of things available to you to be able to do that accurately. So usually the bullet has to pass through at what we consider most of the time at least two surfaces or at least 2 points where you can link together to give you that accurate trajectory. If it only passes through one thing, like if you saw on the previous slide where we had the picture of the glass, that was in a windshield, and that was a picture that I actually took at a scene. So these shots were coming from inside the vehicle out. So the bullet only passed through the windshield. So that's a very thin surface and only 1 point essentially. So all I could say in those cases were that the bullet originated from inside the vehicle and went out, and I couldn't really get an angle or anything on that because of just that thin surface that it passed through. Now, if it had passed through the windshield and then hit something else, we would have then had that second point, that secondary point that we could have gotten some angle on, and basically had a little bit more information to tell about the trajectory. So, in some cases you're limited to what you actually can do because of the path that the bullet took. But still, usually you can at least say something about it, depending on what what your level of expertise is. So, yeah, trajectory is really big, especially in shooting scenes, and it can help, um, you know, basically what are the possibilities that the shooter was in this relative location versus another location at the time the shot was fired? And you can rule out possibilities as well in those instances.
In my experience on the topic of bloodstain analysis is it's probably not used as often as you think it may be used, but the other thing is it's a perishable skill. So
Yes.
sending someone to, a 1 week course and then expecting that person to be your bloodstain patent expert it's an unrealistic expectation. In addition to constant training, you have to use them at scenes. They need to be proficiency tested, but then they also need to just generally have some time to practice on non-scenes at the lab. Has that also been your experiences as well?
Yes, absolutely. All of our people get proficiency tested in trajectory as well as bloodstain and the other aspects of our job. So, but bloodstain is probably the least used of our requests. But we do try to do it on scenes where we feel like it would be beneficial for sure. Mostly to gain some experience as well.
And Ivy, for you all, when a firearm evidence came in, what was the priority between fingerprints, test firing, NIBIN? What was the normal sequence?
The sequence was fingerprints first. And so we would process the gun for fingerprints, and we were able to do the full sequential processing, and then we would send it down to firearms, because if you did it before, you risk destroying any fingerprints that may be on there between firing or handling. And something, again, fingerprint related, I won't talk about it all day, but I wanted to mention it on a previous slide and I didn't. For AFIS, for our automated fingerprint identification system, something that some people may not know is if you put an unknown print in AFIS, it can stay in there and then continuously get searched over new sets of knowns that get put in there. And so that's called a reverse hit. If there's a print that hits to a known that it was entered after that unknown print was in there. You can also search palms in APHIS, and you can use APHIS to search for knowns, known standards before you go through the effort of taking knowns from a victim or a person of interest. So utilizing that if you can before to alleviate some of the burden.
Excellent. So I think we're at our question and answer period now, Elise.
Yeah, thank you all. That was an excellent discussion. We do have some questions in the Q&A. So I'll kind of go through these one by one. So the first question, I guess it's in general for like the entire group, but if you all are familiar with it specifically, if you're familiar with teleforensics to support rich data collaborations between the on-site personnel and off-site SMEs to address evidence challenges. I can open that up to folks in the chat too, if you're familiar with that. Michael Melton is interested in speaking with you all.
Yeah, I think you certainly would be able to talk afterwards as well, Michael, but you're hitting the nail on the head with some areas, right? That no one at 2 a.m. knows everything when they get called out to a scene. So the ability to reach back to an expert in a particular area. So, you know, as was mentioned, say bloodstain pattern analysis, extremely important that you're using the expertise available. And kind of in any of our fields, I think once you get to the point where you think you know everything and there's nothing left to learn, that's usually the time that I tell people to retire, because you're not learning anymore. But.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question, are you familiar with an agency that performs, or are you all familiar with agencies that perform case triage on solvability using an algorithm and structured professional judgment instead of only unstructured judgment?
Is that for like which evidence we're submitting for analysis? Like triage of the evidence being submitted? Maybe.
I will wait. So it didn't give any context. So I'll see, Michael, if you're still on and able to give some context in the chat or Q&A, that would be great so we can better answer your question. While we wait, so I had a question. Let's make sure. What are your recommendations for note taking at the scene? Do you all prefer checklists or more free-flowing note taking?
I'm a checklist person, because I forget stuff. I couldn't tell you what I had for lunch yesterday. I can't tell you where my keys are right now. So I definitely couldn't tell you everything I'm supposed to do, like I said, at 3 a.m. when I get called out in the middle of the night. But I do kind of like the ability to have some written notes somewhere, because like we said at the beginning, every scene's kind of different. So you need some flexibility, but I think some areas are good to keep standard.
I like checklists as the backbone and then kind of filling in the extra detail where it's necessary and tailoring your checklist to the things that you're seeing a lot or things that you may forget easily.
Awesome, thank you. So Michael did follow up to our question. So to follow up to the question, was prioritize going to the crime scene. So reminder of the question, using performing case triage on solvability using an algorithm and structured professional judgment instead of only unstructured judgment. And if you're familiar with any agencies that do that.
I'm currently not, no, on going to the scene. For us, it's the agency is requesting our help, and that's usually why we make the call to go. If it's something that we feel like we can walk them through over the phone, then, you know, some scenes are, I hate to say simple, but relatively speaking, where we don't feel like we would do anything different than they would on scene. You know, we can make that call, but usually if they're calling us for help, we usually go to help process that scene. So
Yeah, I would just say we would keep not so much like Michele said, when the call comes, you kind of have to go, but as far as the usability of evidence that gets submitted to the lab and then the results that the lab provides, we would try to keep those numbers so we knew that what we were submitting at least had a fairly decent chance, or what our people were processing had a decent chance of potentially getting latent prints or getting DNA from it. And then if you're an agency out there that is constantly submitting something to your lab and not getting the results that you think, you may want to, you know, even a simple conversation with the lab of how are other agencies doing? You know, are they getting the same results that we are? And to initiate that conversation is, I think, very valuable.
Thank you all. And we have one additional question before we wrap up. Has the state lab had any success with touch DNA on spent shell casings?
I could take this one if you guys want. We actually have. We get profiles. It's a small percentage of the time, but we still get them, and we actually were able to solve a serial killer case strictly by the DNA recovered from fired cartridge cases on scene. We had somebody who was going around shooting individuals who were homeless. And so not a whole lot of evidence was being left behind except cartridge cases. And so after about the third shooting, they started realizing that these probably were linked based on the MO. And essentially, about the third or fourth shooting, they were able to recover a profile from the fired cartridge cases, and that's swabbing them all together to try to maximize that DNA profile. And that case actually just went to trial recently. It happened several years ago, of course, but the individual was found guilty. So, and that was really the main forensic evidence that they had.
So, well, thank you all so much. That's the conclusion of the questions. Patrick, if you're able to pull up our last slide. So thank you all for joining today. Please join us for our next webinar. That's in January 2025. It probably seems much further away than it actually is. And then our next slide. Yep. If you have any questions for the team, or if you're interested in getting additional resources from us, please feel free to reach out via our website. There's a contact information there, and signing up again for our newsletter, or you can email us at the email provided below. Also for event updates, I mentioned for event updates and information, especially reference our National Case Close Project convening, which we're going to be hosting in March of 2025. You can sign up for our listserv on the website to get additional information. Thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a great day.